Wales, and I have with me today Tiana Spice, our Membership and Communications Manager and our Member Protection Information Officer for Tennis New South Wales. So welcome to National Child Protection Week, and thank you for being a part of our training. Now, before we start today, I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, wherever we may be in New South Wales or in Australia. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to welcome any Indigenous people to our meeting today. So welcome to everyone, us Tennis New South Wales stakeholders. As I mentioned, it's National Child Protection Week, and that's as promoted by the National Association for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, or NAPCAN, in conjunction with the Federal Government's Department of Social Services. And the theme for 2021 is that every child in every community needs a fair go. And it's great to see so many of our members here today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we have our President of Tennis New South Wales, Melissa Acton, is joining us today. And we've had board representation at both of these sessions, and it's really wonderful to see our board takes this extremely seriously, as I'll take you through in a moment. And we really adhere to our zero tolerance policy that we have set out in our framework documents. So welcome, Melissa. The theme also this year in National Child Protection Week is about the importance of the bigger picture in addressing child abuse and neglect. And it's quite timely that this new legislation has come into effect in New South Wales to really reflect the findings of the Royal Commission and embed that into law in New South Wales. So I'd just like to mention that this training is New South Wales specific. So anyone that's joining us today that does work across states, this is really limited to Tennis New South Wales, so just please keep that in mind. There will be national training rolled out by Tennis Australia very shortly in the next month or so, and there will be information provided in relation to that. You will probably get a communication directly from Tennis Australia, but you'll also get a communication from us at Tennis New South Wales inviting you to participate in that training, which will be run by the Tennis Australia Integrity and Compliance Unit. And I would strongly advise and recommend that you do attend that training, which will complement the training that I'm giving today in a much more practical way in relation to safeguarding issues across our tennis landscape. The way we're going to run today's session is that there'll be about 20 to 30 minutes of content, and I would ask please that you hold any questions until the end. If you would like to, as the session is going on, please pop your question in the chat box and then we'll come back to those questions at the end of the content. Otherwise, you can ask your question on camera. Just as I mentioned before, please be aware the session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded and you don't want to have your face showing, please turn your camera off and ask your question through the chat box. So this is our second session we've had this week, and our final session for anyone who can't stay for the duration this evening, or if you'd like to recommend the training to anyone else at your club or your venue, we do have one more session on Friday at 10 a.m. So today's session will be giving an overview of the Children's Guardian Amendment Child Safe Scheme Bill, which is currently sitting before New South Wales Parliament. So it has passed the Legislative Assembly, and it was introduced to the Legislative Council on the 9th of June 2021 when it was declared urgent, and it's expected to pass at a sitting date in the near future. Now, we don't know when that is, and it could possibly be this week, but it was when the bill was presented to myself and to Lawrence Robertson through the Office of Sport earlier this year. They did anticipate that if it wasn't passed in July, that it would be passed in September. So we are expecting this legislation to come in fairly shortly. So the Office of the Children's Guardian conducted public consultation on the exposure draft of the initial version of this bill between December last year and February this year. And at the time, it was only the Office of Sport that was actually caught by this scheme. And the public consultation that came out demonstrated that there were many stakeholders who considered that there should be a wider scope of organisations caught by this bill, which would be consistent with the recommendations made by the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The broader scope included sporting organisations and organisations that provide recreational services. So the definition of what a child-safe organisation will be under the Children's Guardian Act will now include the following definitions. So a club or other body providing programs or services of a recreational or sporting nature for children, and in which workers are required to hold a working with children check clearance under the relevant legislation. So I'm sure as many of you will be aware that captures most, if not all of us. And in terms of who is responsible, so the bill talks a lot about the person responsible for the child safe organisation, and that is the head of the child safe organisation. So that may be your president or your CEO or some other person in the most senior leadership position who's responsible for the operations of your club or your venue. So what's new? What the bill is seeking to do is to adopt the child safe standards, so the national standards, the 10 standards that you are probably aware of and that are set out in our framework document, and requires child safe organisations to implement the standards through systems, policies and processes. They will also require the Office of the Children's Guardian to work with us as child safe organisations to raise awareness, build capability and promote the implementation of the standards. And importantly, it will provide the Children's Guardian with new powers to monitor, investigate and enforce the implementation of the standards. Now, I will cover the standards in detail later on in this presentation. So what needs to be done to make sure that you are compliant with the Child Safe scheme? There's a number of things that are set out as being indicative that an organisation is complying with the Child Safe standards. And those include a statement of commitment to child safety, having a child safe policy in place, having a code of conduct which would apply to your employees or your management or your committee members, as well as a human resources policy and a risk management plan. And then also there's a requirement for continuous improvement. So making sure that once these policies are in place, that you do have a mechanism to regularly review them to make sure that they remain current to the operations of your business. So what are the enforcement mechanisms? This is, I know this is on everyone's mind when we see that there are enforcement mechanisms available to a regulator. So there's a number of things that the Office of Children's Guardian can now do or will be able to do. They can request information from a child safe organisation in writing, asking for information on how that organisation is compliant with the standards. They can also monitor that organisation's compliance with the standards, and they can conduct an investigation if they receive a complaint or if the organisation fails to respond to a recommendation that is made. So I've set out there the maximum penalties that may be applicable in the event of non-compliance. So a failure to comply with a compliance notice would be a maximum penalty of $27,500 for corporations and $5,500 for others. And then you'll see the next section there, a failure to comply with an enforceable undertaking is more severe. Now, an enforceable undertaking is the very last step in the enforcement process. So after the Children's Guardian's gone through those 3 steps that are mentioned there, so requesting information in writing, asking for compliance and monitoring that. If there is still non-compliance after that point, that's when the Children's Guardian may ask for an enforceable undertaking from the organisation, and it would be a failure to comply with that. So it would be a systemic failure of the organisation to embed practices despite having several opportunities to do so. The other thing to keep in mind with this scheme is that it will be subject to information sharing laws between the Office of the Children's Guardian and the police of the relevant state or territory and also the Commonwealth. And you can imagine why that would be, because if there was a complaint of child abuse raised at an organisation through the police would then be able to talk to the Office of the Children's Guardian about what had happened there if there was a failure of the organisation to adequately respond to the complaint, and that's when that information could be shared. So it's just something to keep in mind. We'll now go through the standards and the compliance piece that comes with those. So very helpfully, the Office of Sport has put together suggested practical compliance check boxes for sporting organisations to embed the child safe standards into practice and also into the culture at your organisation. So those resources we have got together, and we've got a fantastic resource that you will receive on Friday at the conclusion of Child Safety Week as an attendee of these sessions, where we have the 10 standards and that practical compliance set out for you. So it will be a nice refresher, and it's also a nice resource to have and display around your club. So the child safe standards, and as I mentioned earlier, these are set out in our Safeguarding Children Framework document, which is available on our website. I'll take you through each of these one by one with the Office of Sport guidance, and to demonstrate how you can implement these into your practice. Standard 1, child safety is embedded in leadership, governance and culture. This is really targeted at obviously the leadership team at your organisation, at your club committee, your CEO, and really it's really about making sure that the child safety culture comes from the top. There's some examples of how that can be implemented, and I think one of the easiest ones that I could recommend for you to do today is to make sure that child safety is on all your meeting agendas. So we do that at Tennis New South Wales. It's on all of our board committee meetings, our audit and risk committee meetings, and also some of our management committee meetings as well. We have a child safety update. It's quick and easy to do, and it really just gets everyone just thinking about that in that meeting space, and making sure that if there's anything that needs to be done, and also just getting information about where your initiatives are at as well. Standard 2, listen, act and respond to children. Now this is targeted at how you engage with your youth. If you have children in your coaching club, or you have children playing while their parents are playing tennis, it's about thinking about how the children are there, getting their feedback and talking to them about safety. And that's where resources come in handy, as well as having that mechanism to talk to the youth and make sure that they are engaged with the operations and that you can get their feedback. Standard 3, families and communities are informed and involved. Again, this is about how you communicate with the parents and families, and making sure there is that two-way communication at the club. Standard 4, equity is upheld and diverse needs are taken into account. I think this is really obviously goes to the very core of our culture at tennis, which is making sure that tennis is safe and inclusive to everybody that wants to access our sport. And so the examples of how to do this here are just activities to make sure all children can be included, making sure that you are taking into account diverse needs and backgrounds, and having a diversity and inclusion plan if you can. And for those of you who are aware of our new strategic plan, inclusion and diversity is called out as one of our foundations, and this is something that is really moving forward through Tennis New South Wales, and we have resources available to help you with this. Standard 5, staff and volunteers working with children are suitable and supported. The obvious example of that there is the Working with Children check and the background checks. As you'd know, Tennis New South Wales takes this very seriously and has increased its Working with Children check compliance this year, really demonstrating how this culture is being embedded across our sport, and really getting everybody thinking about making sure that everyone who should have a Working with Children check does have one. Standard 6, child-focused process to respond to complaints of child abuse. Now, we obviously at Tennis, we have our member protection policy and our Safeguarding Children Code of Conduct. And those are the two documents that you are bound to as a member of Tennis New South Wales, and that in turn that we ask you to bind your members to as well. And really those documents form the foundation of the complaint handling. They are designed to be child focused and trauma informed. So those resources are available to you, and we will go through that again shortly. Standard 7, staff and volunteers know how to keep children safe. So this is all about training and education. Now, Tennis Australia, as I mentioned, will be rolling out their external safeguarding training later this year, very, very soon. There are resources available on Bounce for those of you who have access to Bounce, including the Safeguarding Children module, which was rolled out earlier this year. It's a fantastic resource. I highly recommend that you do it. It's a great one to sit down with the committee and go through it. It's interactive, it asks you questions and gets you thinking about the basics of child safety, and making sure that you are thinking about how your practices embed those safe practices. Standard 8, minimise the opportunity for abuse to occur. Now, this is all about the physical environment, and some of these things, would certainly not be an easy fix if you do identify risks, but it is about having a risk management plan and knowing what the risks are and what your mitigation strategy would be. Standard 9, implementation of the child safe standards is reviewed. And as I mentioned earlier, this is about continuous review. Going back to the first standard, it's really about, if you have this as a standing agenda item at your committee meetings, you will always be thinking about child safety. If you have these 10 tiles with you, you could go through them. It will only take you 5-10 minutes to go through and make sure that you are keeping on top of what the practices are and if there's been any changes. And standard 10, policies and procedures document how the organisation is child safe. Now, this will be the important one for everyone to think about, because if you do happen to get a complaint or you do get a request from the Office of the Children's Guardian about how you comply with the standards, having that document there to show how you do that will be important. And at Tennis New South Wales, we have our framework document, which I've referred to previously. And that really that sets out how we say we are a child safe organisation. And I'll take you through that now, how the standards are implemented at Tennis New South Wales and how we are compliant. So that, as mentioned, is the first point there, that Tennis New South Wales 2021 Safeguarding Children Framework document. If you're not familiar with that document, you will get a copy of that again at the end of this week, so you can refer to it. And I would highly recommend that you go through that, because it does contain our statement of commitment, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the must-haves for this new legislation. And there's no reason why you couldn't adopt our framework or adopt the statement of commitment contained in that document to help you become compliant. The Child Safe Policy, as earlier mentioned, we have our Safeguarding Children Code of Conduct, which you are bound by as a member of Tennis New South Wales, and in turn that should bind your members. So that document is already there and available for you. The Code of Conduct. So at Tennis, we have a Tennis Code of Conduct, which binds our employees and contractors, and that's really about accountability for an individual's behaviour as an employee of Tennis Australia and Tennis New South Wales. We also have our member protection policy, which also captures other members of our community in terms of their conduct as well. A complaint management policy. So again, the member protection policy, which you already would be familiar with and are bound by, is how complaints are managed of this nature, of the safeguarding nature. We also have Stopline at Tennis New South Wales. So that's a confidential phone service where people can report very serious matters, including child abuse. And a human resources policy. So again, that's an internal document. We have our performance management and discipline policy if an employee or contractor was found to have breached the code of conduct. And finally, the risk management plan. So at Tennis New South Wales, safeguarding children has been identified as a strategic risk, and it's monitored both by our board and our audit and risk committee and we have it on our risk register. So that's how we monitor it. I will take you through the resources now that are available to you, including a template risk management plan, which you may be familiar with. I'd also just say that our team at Tennis New South Wales have been fully trained in these standards. And so as you're thinking about how you might do this, please reach out to your tennis development officer who'll be able to help you locate the resources that are already available to you and discuss with you what else you might want to do and help you with the templates. So I've already mentioned the resources that we have available to you. We have the member protection policy, the Safeguarding Children Code of Conduct, the Safeguarding Toolkit, for those of you who are familiar with it on Bounce. We are reviewing that for the specific purpose of this new legislation. So we will update the checklist in that toolkit so that it is current and references the things that we feel that you will need to do to be compliant with the Child Safe scheme. But there are other resources available to you as well, which are free and they're available online. So here I've mentioned the Office of the Children's Guardian resources. They have a template code of conduct, a template complaints management policy and a template risk management plan, which you can download in Word and adjust for the operations of your business, and that will help you in this space. Outside of these, I would also say that the Office of Sport and Play by the Rules have some fantastic resources and training available to you, and I would encourage you to make use of those and to set some time aside to go through this. There are a lot of resources out there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think the most important thing to remember is that it's about bringing it all together. And as you remember that last standard about having the document that reflects how you are compliant with the standards, and you can use the Tennis New South Wales safeguarding framework as a template to do that, and it will really get you thinking about how your club or your coaching operation or your venue is compliant with the standards. So that concludes the end of the content. Before we go on to questions, I'd just like to pass to Tiana, and Tiana's going to give us an update about our initiatives for this year and where we're at. Thanks, Tiana.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's really great to see you all come out in such large numbers, so thank you. Tennis New South Wales have been working on a number of initiatives for Child Safety Week and to help prepare everyone get ready for these standards and just some upskill in that area. So the initiatives obviously start with these sessions that we've been hosting this week and upskilling everyone and updating everyone on the 10 child safe standards. As Hannah mentioned, we're also working on updating our resources and our toolkit and checklist so that clubs can feel comfortable using that checklist aligning with these 10 standards. We launched our child safety EDM. So that's an e-newsletter that will go out quarterly to all our members, and it will include some information on child safety and different things that you can do at your club. It'll include different information on what Tennis New South Wales is doing to support, and it'll also include some really great case studies on what clubs are doing around the state in this space and what's working really well. So that went out on Sunday. So if you didn't receive that, do let us know. We'll make sure that we add you to the mailing list, but that will go out once a quarter. We're also launching our Member Protection Information Officer Network later this week. So I'll refer to that as an MPIO for the purpose of this presentation. But an MPIO is, for those of you who don't know, is someone who's trained in dealing with complaints and any issues that arise at the club, and they're essentially the go-to person for anyone who has an issue within the club, someone that's trusted and can be confided in. And we do understand that volunteers are hard to come by, and MPIOs are maybe not something that everyone wants to put their hand up for, but it is a really important role, and it is something that our board is looking very closely at in terms of what we require clubs to do in that space. So we are launching that network later this week, and that'll be on Friday at 12 o'clock. And the network's purpose is to get all the MPIOs in the state together and just have an opportunity to connect, share ideas, and just because it can be quite a lonely job. So just making sure that we're connecting that community together and creating a network for people to be able to communicate and be upskilled. So the MPIO training is actually conducted through the Office of Sport. It's a combination of online training and face-to-face. So the online training goes for about 3 hours, and it's through Play by the Rules. And then there's 2 face-to-face sessions over 2 days, and they're for 1 hour. So that's within a group of people from varying sports, and it's provided by the Office of Sport. But Tennis New South Wales are also looking to develop a Member Protection Information Officer course that's tennis specific. So that's something that we'll be working on over the coming months to work to be able to deliver that to our tennis stakeholders shortly. So if anyone was interested in that MPIO network and joining that, it was in the communication that you would have received about this session, a link to join that. And we encourage, even if you're not the MPIO, if you're someone who might be interested in that role or just would like to get a little bit more information on what it might be and what that could be for your club, please join us. It will only be 30 minutes. And if you can't make it but you'd like more information, again, please reach out and we're happy to provide you with that information. Thanks, Hannah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tiana. Look, we'll move to questions, and I noticed that we haven't had any questions pop up in the chat box yet. I'm hoping that might be because everybody is waiting to jump on screen. So are there any questions to start? Just feel free to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand as well at the top right of the Teams functionality there. Oh, it can't have been that good. I'm sure there must be a question out there. Phil, you look like you're ready to ask your question.
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at this one. What's the time frame for us having to get our club ready for this? What sort of time frame are we looking at?
That's a great question. So this was raised at the Office of Sport conference that Lawrence and I were at in May, and Dr. Louise Coe, who's the director of the Office of Children's Guardian, was presenting the bill. And look, the enforcement provisions do come into effect on the day the legislation essentially. So we're not going to know. If the legislation comes in tomorrow, the enforcement provisions in theory are in effect tomorrow. But what Louise has said is that it's the intention of the Office of the Children's Guardian to spend the first 12 months on the awareness and the building capability phase, and that any enforcement would come after that. So we're not anticipating that anyone will be audited or that there'll be any issues within the first 12 months. But having said that, that is not what the legislation says. So that's why it's just really important that we wanted to run this training as soon as we could before it came into effect, so that everybody could be aware of it. So the resources that are available to you will be available to you immediately. So we'll make sure that we get them out to you this week and you can start thinking about it, and just let us know if you need any help with that or getting it together. Because I know it seems like a daunting task, but I think the thing to remember with these sorts of changes in legislation is that, you know, with the increase in powers to the Office of Children's Guardian, there also needs to be an increase in resources. Because if you think about, we have almost 500 members here at Tennis New South Wales. So that's 500 organisations alone that they would be responsible for. And we're just one sport. And this is capturing a huge number of organisations in New South Wales. So I don't want anyone to worry that this is going to be something that, you know, someone's going to come knocking on your door at the beginning of October, because that's certainly not what we anticipate. And I'd also say that if that did happen, that you would reach out to Tiana or myself or someone at Tennis that you are in close contact with immediately. So I hope that answers your question, Phil. The answer is I don't know, but we do hope that there will be a period of around 12 months for everybody to really, you know, for that awareness and that capability building.
So can I ask a second question to that one then?
Sure.
Will Tennis New South Wales be requesting this, like our documentation or program as part of our, you know, working with children, check submissions and so forth in the future? You know, like similar to what you asked for with our COVID safety plans and things like that?
Look, possibly. What will happen is this will, as I said, it's a strategic risk that Tennis New South Wales monitors. So it will be something that the Audit and Risk Committee will discuss and the board will discuss. But if we were going to require documentation like that, obviously you would get sufficient time to prepare it and make sure that you were ready for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hannah, we've got a question in the chat box from Will. It says, you mentioned that members are bound by Tennis New South Wales policies. How can we practically enforce this, especially if members don't receive an overarching document that states the above and that they need to sign it when joining a club and or regularly be reminded of this?
Yeah, so it's really up to the organisation whether you have put that in your terms and conditions and in turn have decided to bind your members to that member protection policy. I think what I would say about that, though, that document really, if you have a look at the application of that document, it captures probably most of your members anyway, by virtue of their tennis activities. So if we do get a complaint under the member protection policy, Tiana and my job is to look at it and to see if it falls within the scope of that policy, and if it does, then what happens next. So look, as members, you need to abide by that, but there are categories that are caught by that policy that would happen anyway, and we don't. We would just be leaving it to the clubs to make the decision about what's appropriate for their terms and conditions. Oh, Ian, you have a question. Oh, sorry, Ian, you're on mute. Do you want to just unmute yourself?
Yep, done that. That's cool. I just want to say, any role in councils where we get the we've got leases from the council for these venues, or some of them have got other still state bodies that they take their leases off. Have they got any role in this to make sure we're compliant with these type of things, or that we're as part of their overseeing of what we do, the operations?
Look, they may do. I think it would depend on the terms of the lease, but also I'm not entirely, I haven't looked at this legislation in terms of how it may affect local government. I've really only looked at it from our perspective as a sporting organisation. So I imagine if the councils did have, if they did have new requirements and that they're not already in the lease, they'd need to discuss those with you.
Yeah, I think I could understand be quite interesting where you've got clubs who have sub-leases, but possibly with their coaches, versus councils having leases directly with coaches, and so where the lines are drawn, who's responsible for what.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing about this legislation is that it's aimed at the organisation itself. So for our purposes, if you are a club or you are a coach and you run your own coaching operation, if you think back to that definition, and I can actually probably move back to it now. If we move back to that definition of what's in it, what a child safe organisation will be, that is what it is. So anybody who falls within this definition is caught by this legislation. So you could have a situation where both the coach and the club are caught by this, so they each individually have to make sure that they comply. So look, it's, it will depend on what your circumstances are, but if this is you, then you need to make sure that you are compliant.
Okay.
If anyone has a question, they have their hand up, we can't see you, just feel free to start talking. We do have a question in the chat box come up. Have you reached out separately to the coaches? So this may be a reference to Tennis Australia accredited coaches. So we've reached out to our members. So this is going to our membership. And as I said, it's New South Wales specific. It will be, the recording of this session will be available online, so we can communicate with the Tennis Australia Coaching Network and have that distributed. But just we want to be careful that state coaches in other states don't think that this applies to them, because this is New South Wales based legislation.
So just on that coaching situation that Ian mentioned, is the onus on the club then to have the coaches go through this process as well, and to make sure that they are compliant in their documentation and so forth? Is there a requirement that each tennis organisation has that kind of that process and the documentation to back that up if we ever get audited, or is it you're only required to keep that for your own organisation?
So I think, look, the standards are quite broad. So, it's more about making sure that your own operations are compliant. If you were aware that a coach wasn't compliant with one of the standards, I would suggest that you would try and take some action to rectify that with them. But, this is really directed at the individual, at the club or at the coach. And the legislation certainly doesn't create some cross liability between the two. So I think it's a matter of looking at what your own operations are and making sure that you're happy that you comply with the standards. We have another question in the chat box. Changes like this are making it more and more difficult for small struggling volunteer-run clubs. If this continues, it might make such clubs unviable in the future. Yes, look, we do understand that we have some very small members out there who have very, very limited resources. We will try and help you as much as we can. As I said earlier, a lot of this has actually already been done. And so, use the resources that are available to you. As Tiana mentioned earlier, the Member Protection Information Officer, so the MPIO role, is a very important one. But if you are a very small club that doesn't have, that only has 2 or 3 on your committee and, 20 members, I know there's lots of those clubs that we have out there, talk to us about alternatives and how we can help you, because all of our staff will be trained MPIOs in the near future. I am an MPIO, Tiana is an MPIO, all of our regional tennis managers are trained MPIOs, and many of our TDOs are as well. So we can help you, and you shouldn't, I think particularly if you were ever to get a complaint about child abuse, you shouldn't ever have to feel that you have to deal with that yourself. You do have the police there as well, which is where these complaints should go. And that, if you read through the safeguarding code and the MPP, and it talks about what the reporting procedure is, it tells you what to do. So we are trying to help everyone as much as we can to make it really easy for you to do this. Unfortunately, we don't have any control over the New South Wales government, and this has caught us all now. So all we can do is move forward and try our best to make sure that you're well supported in getting these resources together. Kathy has asked a question as well. Can a club adopt the child safe policies in a monthly meeting, or does it have to be done at an AGM? I think it can be done at any time. If the club wants, the club should have adopted the MPP and the safeguarding code as a term of its condition of membership with Tennis New South Wales. But if you wanted to go through that and pass a resolution at your next committee meeting, I would encourage you to do that. It doesn't need to be at an AGM. We have another question. Do contractors need to be covered for working with children? Look, I think that's quite a broad question. I think it would depend. Working with children checks are around people who do have contact with children in some way. I would suggest that you contact the Office of Children's Guardian, who can provide some advice on whether or not a particular person is required to get a working with children check. I'll give a few minutes for any other questions, but I just might reiterate what Tiana said earlier about our MPIO network on Friday. Again, this is designed to get more MPIOs trained and engaged with this work and with Tennis New South Wales. So we understand that we have about 60 MPIOs in our network so far. So if you are one of those people and you weren't aware of the network on Friday, please do come along. And even if you're just interested or you want to see what we're going to do, please join us. We want to meet with our MPIOs regularly. We want to create a network where people feel supported in these roles, and that where we can discuss best practice, troubleshoot some tennis specific scenarios, and really make sure that this is the sort of role that you don't have to do by yourself, and you don't have to feel alone when you're doing it, because we would like to get our members talking to each other about what they do. And there's something that I always enjoy is hearing what other people are doing, because I think that's how you learn. So something that's, lots of people will have excellent tips and tricks, so please do come along to the network if you can.
Hi there, it's Jonathan Gray. You skipped over my question some time ago.
Oh, did we miss you, Jonathan? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Jonathan. I typed my response to you. Paul Conroy is your tennis development officer, so I'll connect you with him in an email after this, if you like. And with the TDOs conducting spot checks, Hannah, I might leave that on to you.
Yeah. So, sorry, Jonathan.
I got the answer from Tiana, so that was fine. I published a subsequent question.
Yes, so the spot checks.
No.
Another
subsequent question to that.
Oh, I don't think it's come through.
No, we haven't. We can't see that.
Okay, so the question was, will Tennis New South Wales publish in some fashion learnings or perhaps redacted incident summaries from time to time, say quarterly or semi-annually, to promote learning?
That's a great idea. We could certainly do that in our Child Safe newsletter. As you said, we'd have to be careful with making sure that identities were kept anonymous, but that's a really great idea, Jonathan. Thank you. We can put that in the Child Safe newsletter that Tiana had referred to earlier. I think that's always good to think about those learnings in that space. So yes, thank you for that suggestion. That's great. Do we have any other questions?
Hannah, we've had a question come through from Will. Is it the club who has the lease that become ultimately responsible if, say, a coaching team rents out courts, but there is no one supervising the premises and an incident happened after hours? No supervision can happen due to online bookings.
Yeah, look, I think it's a bit difficult to answer hypothetical questions, especially when this legislation is not in effect yet. So, look, I think it's just going to depend on what the circumstances are at the time. And I think that this legislation is not really aimed at specific incidents. It's more about creating a culture at the club and implementing the standards. So it's not really about pointing blame when incidents take place. Unless we have any other questions, we have our CEO with us, Lawrence Robertson, and as all of you are probably aware, Lawrence has got some limited time left with us, which is very sad. But Lawrence is going to just wrap up this session today, just briefly. So Lawrence, I might bring you on now. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you to both yourself and Tiana for a fantastic session. And I know for many of you who've joined the call, it's great to see the numbers that we have on this evening, which I think is a real demonstration of how important each of you view this issue. And I think, as Hannah probably would have opened the session with, this is now an aspect of the work that we do day to day that is critical for us to provide a child-safe environment for those that participate, and then also to support each and every one of you who are providing tennis in different shapes and forms across the state. And I hear the comments and I see the questions, and yes, I know this feels at times that it's another layer of bureaucracy or another ask of volunteers. But I think, in situations like this where, the integrity and the future of our sport is so integral or so critical to providing these safe environments, we only need to look at, the challenges that gymnastics have faced in the US and even, closer to home here in Australia, that, some elements of these can sometimes spiral out of control. So it's great to see so many of you on the call this evening and demonstrating your commitment and interest in this space. And say Hannah and Tiana are really our appointed experts within the organisation. But as one or two of you have asked as well, that some of that day-to-day stuff in terms of ensuring that you're making your resources available and you're raising the awareness on the ground, our field team can assist with that. Just one last comment I'll make was one of the questions was related to local government. Myself and Hannah have been engaged in conversations with the Office of Local Government, and we've continued to raise this in particular with the federal government as well. We think there is a responsibility for local governments to do more, particularly in their leasing of sporting facilities, in helping ensuring that those providers, a club or a body providing programs or services, are compliant, and so we are pushing local government to do more, particularly related to leases. So it's something that we are picking up with the various levels of government. Listen, I just thought I would just the last 5 minutes again just to thank each and every one of you. We know that it's been tough the last, what are we now, 8 weeks, 7, maybe even more than that now, sort of 9-10 weeks since we went into a level of restrictions, and now we're in our in a full lockdown. We've worked hard with our colleagues at the New South Wales Office of Sport and with Health to try and provide you with timely and relevant and accurate updates to the various changes that took place. As it was, similar to the first time around, as we went into lockdown, we were all very fixated on Gladys's daily media updates, and I hope you can appreciate that. Whilst there is a temptation to get information out on the back of media conferences, we've learned a lesson or two during the last 12 to 18 months that before we get the public health order and we understand exactly what is the intention of those orders and restrictions, we've been very wary to publish anything in terms of any updated recommendations and guidelines. And again, I do want to reiterate that what we publish are simply they're simply recommendations and guidelines. It is the responsibility of the club, the venue, the operator. You need to consider your own circumstances. As I say, we can provide guidance. We interpret the public health orders, particularly as to what they mean for tennis, and then try and provide you with some guidance and support. But a bit like Will's question a minute ago, we've had lots of scenarios thrown at us. And fundamentally, it's sometimes not our position to be, providing any legal advice. It's really for us to provide some guidance and recommendations. One thing we have been asked the question on, and we know this is going to become more and more relevant, is around vaccination. We all hear the message from government in terms of getting vaccinated. We've had a couple of clubs reach out this week in regards to, how will we monitor or what will our recommendations be around double vaccination. I think it's fair to say if we're still in a position where 50% of our clubs are not offering online booking, I think it's it's too much for us to ask you to be monitoring whether people are double vaccinated. So, our recommendation for the time being in regards to the playing of tennis is not going to shift. Our view of the change that's going to be coming in on the 13th September is fundamentally that will still rest with the individual, and we wouldn't expect our clubs to be monitoring who is and isn't on the court, particularly in relation to whether they're vaccinated or not. So our recommendations are not likely to change in that regard in the next few days. We are hearing that there may be a roadmap announced tomorrow from the Premier. We'll obviously keep a close eye on that. And as we talk about our way out of this current lockdown, we were left with no choice this week to announce further postponement of the Australian ranking calendar until 1 November. So, for the time being, tennis, I think as a community have responded incredibly well to the latest restrictions. We are still being able to get on court. Our colleagues and neighbours in Victoria aren't. Our colleagues and neighbours in the ACT can get on court, both in terms of playing and coaching. So we're in a fortunate position, and really I don't think we want to do anything more to jeopardise that. I think we're only going to be in this for another maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And then we'll start to see some of the restrictions ease in, a lot further. So, so that's the sort of update from a COVID perspective. You will have noticed we have published this week our competitive play blueprint, which is a national blueprint. The team will be conducting sessions next week. I think we've got 3 sessions planned for coaches, clubs and parents, but anyone else who's interested to understand what the changes coming in the competitive play network. Fundamentally, we'll be moving away from a ranking system to ratings, and that will mean for club administrators and club committees, we will be looking further down the track to embrace, ratings and rating software at a club level, so that everyone's working off the same metric, I guess. So we have 3 sessions available next week, so please feel free to join those to learn more about the future of competitive play, not just for our higher performing juniors, but for the entire landscape across Australia. And then finally, just a quick mention towards the summer. We've had some questions. The AO at the moment will take place, and not at the moment, the AO this year will take place in January in Melbourne, the last 2 weeks. The scenarios now being played out will just simply be what are the vaccination levels and what to what amount of what levels will crowds be allowed on site at Melbourne Park. What will that mean in terms of restrictions on activities and player movement and so on and so forth. But you know, the great news is the Australian Open will take place in Melbourne in January. And then the next question is, will there be tennis in Sydney? Well, we are working very hard with New South Wales Health and the government at the moment. We're a lot closer than we were last year. There's still a couple of hurdles to get over, but I'm an optimist and certainly very hopeful that we will see world-class tennis in Sydney in January. And whilst I will move on from my position as CEO with Tennis New South Wales, I have made a commitment that if there is world-class tennis in January in Sydney, then I'll stick around to help the organisation see that through. So conscious we might only have 5 or 10 minutes left. I know this was scheduled for an hour. If anybody does have any broader COVID-related questions, then very happy to take them now. You can post them, as some people have been doing. Feel free to stick your hand up. Or if there's any other questions you might have for Hannah or myself, and I believe our President Mel's on the call as well, then we'll be happy to take them. No, silence is golden. Excellent. All right. Well, listen. Oh, sorry. Is someone there?
Jonathan here from Hornsby, Lawrence.
Hello, Jonathan. How are you going?
Hi, Lawrence. I was going to ask the AO and the ATP Cup question, but just if you could elaborate slightly on the Sydney January timing and conditionality, perhaps?
Yeah, look, a lot of it fundamentally, Jonathan, comes down to can we provide an appropriate environment for the players to quarantine and to train and potentially compete. And so we're looking at how we might construct a bubble environment, both here in New South Wales and 1 or 2 other states, to help take some of the load from those players that would be coming in to participate at the AO in January. You know, that's likely to revolve around Sydney Olympic Park and you know, pretty heavily managed biosecurity operation around maintaining distance between those players who are coming in to quarantine, and then the ability for them to train in an appropriate environment and then potentially compete. So that's the sort of the core conditions. And you know, from a playing group perspective, what they don't want to happen is similar to what happened last year, where even on a very closely managed charter flight where people were spaced out and so on and so forth, one individual on the flight tests positive and then the entire flight are taken out, and then they're all in hard lockdown, I guess, or hard isolation for 14 days. The playing group will simply not go for that. They'd like to see an environment created very similar to what has been taking place the world over. And I think conversations with ministers are that once we get to our vaccination thresholds, they're very keen that the state reopens, because events such as ourselves help drive the economy and maintain people's jobs and so on and so forth. So where we are now will look very different to where we are in late December and January. So I think the government are taking a very practical view on this, but at the same time have made it very clear that they wouldn't expect to offer any conditions for players that would be any different to any taxpayers. So that's probably the conditions that you might be alluding to. No, well, listen, look, this wasn't obviously my session. I'll pass back to Hannah to wrap up. But again, thanks so much for all of your involvement. Great turnout this evening, and back to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks so much for that and for joining us. And look, thank you everybody for making the time. I know it's dinner time now, so we won't keep you, but this session will be recorded, so you'll have access to it if you do want the information. Please also feel free to reach out to Tiana or I at any time. It is busy at Tennis New South Wales, but we will get back to you with some information or put you in touch with your local TDO or someone who can help you. So please don't feel like you need to do this by yourselves. We will give you all the resources that we can and try and make it as easy for you to implement as quickly as you can. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks also to the staff who've joined tonight. I appreciate it. And yes, we look forward to seeing you again soon. I hope everyone stays safe. And yes, just hang in there. It's tough in this lockdown, but hopefully not too much longer.